Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to introduce Rabbi Johnny Solomon, who is a Jewish educator and writer, has an MA in Jewish education and smicha from the quarters. He divides his time between teaching and working as a Jewish educational consultant, editing Jewish books for Mosaic Press, and providing online spiritual coaching, halachic consultation, and one-to-one learning with people around the world. Rav Johnny also writes a daily daf yomi, contributes to the RZ weekly podcast, and is a posek to his local shul. Rabbi Solomon is also known as the virtual rabbi. He is a rabbi for those without a rabbi. He loves coaching people, answering their halachic questions, and sharing deep and inspirational ideas with them. Through his work as the virtual rabbi, he provides online spiritual coaching, halachic consultation, and the one-to-one learning. It's very appropriate that Rabbi Solomon will speak about Rabbi Jonathan Sacks because he had a very close relationship with him when Rabbi Sacks was with us. His smicha through the Matfei Kolo came partially for Rabbi Sacks, and he was involved in Rabbi Sacks's philosophy and thought and helping Rabbi Sacks give tshuvot and other things. The decades where he was in London before Rabbi Sacks passed. And so it's very appropriate for us to have Rabbi Solomon speak about Rabbi Sacks. So on behalf of Rabbi Rafi, I thank Rabbi Solomon for his time and for his thoughts, and I look forward to it.
Okay, thank you so much, Kvod Harav. I know there may have been some kind of sound issue. For those who are hearing us, can you hear okay now? Okay, Yofi. And what I'm going to do now is share my screen, and hopefully you should be able to see me and the screen. If that's the case, please thumbs up. If that's not the case, tell me you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, beautiful. So, my friends, firstly, it's a great honor, great privilege. Thank you, Rabbi Tarragon, for your lovely introduction. It's really a great honor to be a contributor to this series, this really important series, because we lost our Rebbe, we lost our teacher, but his Torah continues to speak to us very, very deeply. And really, it's our duty, now that he's given us such profound works, both in terms of the books he left us and the videos he recorded for us, and the teachings that we receive from him, for us to dwell on what we learned from this giant of Torah thought, from this great, great leader, and ask ourselves, what do we do and how do we apply this learning, these teachings for our modern age? And what I'd like to talk about is a topic which is often overlooked. In fact, the topic that I'm discussing today was the basis of an article I wrote 7 years ago. So I've been considering this question for quite some time, but it's the first time I've spoken about it in public. And it's really a question relating to Rabbi Sacks's perception, understanding, and teachings on halacha, and specifically who is qualified to pasken halacha for our modern age. Now, this, of course, is a very, very pressing question, because we have so many issues nowadays that deserve and require significant halachic solutions. And as we turn to Rabbi Sacks for so much in terms of our questions relating to Jewish thought, he has within his corpus of writing and teaching insights which I think are very, very important in terms of guiding us about whom and the frameworks within which we should be seeking halachic guidance. And before I actually start answering that question, I want to talk to you about how I know what I know about his answer. Because you may well say, well, one second, I don't remember him writing a book about pure halacha. And I have all of Rabbi Sacks's books, and I'd agree with you. So I want to first tell you, how do I know what I know? And let me already begin by answering it. And so here on my screen, hopefully you should be able to see it. I have here the following. Where does Rabbi Sacks talk about halacha? Well, first and foremost, what people, especially not from the UK, may not know, and even people from the UK may not realize, is there was a journal published by what was then known as Jews College called Le'ela. And in Le'ela, between 1981 and 1986, Rabbi Sacks, who of course was both a lecturer in Jews College and then later on the principal, wrote a column titled Contemporary Halacha, summarizing contemporary responsa, a bit like what Rav Jacobovitz did in Tradition, which was then taken over by Rabbi Blythe. And those of you who have not read those columns will certainly delight in them. And in preparing this shiur, I realized something which, when I prepared this article I mentioned previously 7 years ago, was certainly not the case. Until recently, the old editions of Le'ela basically had to be physically found and read and copied. But the work of the Office of Rabbi Sacks in the past few months has meant that they've collated a lot of his lesser well-known writings. And if you go on the Rabbi Sacks website, you can find these columns. And his summaries of fascinating responsa, and how he presents these questions is itself a masterclass in education and in framing contemporary rabbinic discourse. So point number one, we're going to be looking at least one of his columns, actually the one specifically from 1986 in Le'ela. And there, especially in his introductory paragraph, he says some very deep things about halacha. Point number two, a few years previously in Le'ela, as part of his attempt to engage the Anglo-Jewish rabbinate, he invited them to discuss issues taking place in the community. That was his article titled Response, the Rabbinate. Interestingly, almost nobody did respond. You know, we often think Rabbi Sacks, this giant of Jewish thought. Well, in 1983, when he invited his rabbinical colleagues to discuss pressing matters, almost nobody, in fact, nobody really responded. He was very frustrated and he stopped that column. But nevertheless, in his remarks in the second article titled Zero Response, he says some very, very deep things relating to halacha. Then there's something which I have, which is a gem. It's not even on the Rabbi Sacks website, but I'll be passing it on to them. In 1987, he delivered the 5th Sir Emanuel Jacobovitz lecture at Jews College, titled 3 Approaches to Halacha. It is a remarkable thing. And I used to work in the building, otherwise known as Jews College. And when I found a transcript of that essay, I took a copy. So I have one here. And in that talk, he gives us a profound window into how he sees what halacha should be, in particular, who he feels to be qualified in determining halacha. So we'll be quoting from there. You may have read his essay in the 1992 book, Rabbinical Authority and Personal Autonomy, titled Creativity and Innovation in Halacha. That was delivered in the First Orthodox Forum in 1989, and we'll be quoting from there. Beyond this, in a number, especially of his earlier books, he talks directly about halacha, slightly less in his later books, primarily because he wants to be as broad as possible as a leader, although certainly there's some real gems that you can find. And if you want to see some quotes of Rabbi Sacks about halacha, I invite you to look at my collection of quotes from all of his writings, titled Chiefly Quotes, which you can find on the Rabbi Sacks website or on my website. Beyond this, in 2012, Rabbi Sacks was interviewed by Chava Tior Samuelson. It's a very, very wide-ranging interview, and it's published in full in the book Universalizing Particularity. And there too, he makes some interesting remarks about halacha. And then finally, around about 2014, he interviews his teacher, Rabbi Nachum Eliezer Rabinovich, and the transcript of that interview is found at the end of Rabbi Rabinovich's book, Misilot Bilvavam, and some of the questions that Rabbi Sacks raises to his teacher relate to halacha, and I think they tell us a lot about what he thought about halacha and decision-making. So I share this with you just for you to know that, as Chazal say on the words of Eshet Chayil, Hayta ka'aniyot sochem merchak tavi lachma, that divrei Torah ani b'makom echad v'ashirim b'makom acher. No, there is no single book saying Rabbi Sacks on halacha, but if you look around, you can find some gems. And what I hope to do in this shiur is share with you those gems, and I've typed them out in full for us to read, for us to digest, for us to discuss. This is less so a shiur than more so a conversation. And once we go through some of the sources, I'd really love to hear what you have to say. With that in mind, I'd like to ask you a very simple question. How is halacha determined? And this comes from the opening paragraph of that column from 1986 in Le'ela, where he discusses contemporary halacha and then goes on to summarize some contemporary responsa rulings. And he tells us something very majestic here. I want to read it through slowly, because if you read it with care, you'll notice he's not just telling us a textbook definition, but he's giving us a window into his understanding of how halacha not just is determined, but how it should be determined. And that itself is gold dust. So what does he say? Halacha is often thought of as a mechanical process in which Jewish tradition is brought to bear on a problem and yield a single unequivocal answer. Permitted or forbidden, valid or invalid, pure or impure. By the way, he isn't just saying that because he's trying to make an argument. There are some people who very much see halacha that way. The halacha is more of a science than an art. But then he goes on to tell us, if this were so, a posek, a halachic authority, would be distinguished by his technical mastery of the literature alone, meaning a posek simply would be the person who knows the most amount of information. But this does grave injustice to the situation. He feels that is a misrepresentation of what a halachic decider, a posek, is, what a posek should be. Some problems brought to the court of halacha are inherently complex, and the role of the posek is anything but mechanical, meaning it's not about finding the answer in a book. How is a question to be framed? Meaning when somebody brings a shaila, you need to ask yourself, what is this shaila? My Rav Dain Lotpian, about whom Rabbi Sacks had so many lovely things to say, would always, when presented with a shaila, saying, is this even a question? Meaning you need to understand, is this something that requires a halachic answer? Or perhaps this is something which is just intuitively obvious to do and doesn't require recall or reference to halachic works. Which sources are relevant to it and which, though they seem to be relevant, in fact address a different situation? Meaning, where do we place this shaila within the orbit of all the other halachic teachings and precedents and principles and values? How is a balance to be struck between direct precedent and the surrounding universe of broad halachic and agadic principles? Meaning, is this something which is merely about law, but or also about values? Should one confront a problem in isolation or in its human setting, in the context of the people, place, or time concerned? Meaning, does it matter this question is being asked in this generation rather than a previous generation? How significant is the context of this question in terms of determining its resolution? He goes on to say in the same paragraph, there are matters calling for judgment or what used to be called wisdom. And the great posek is distinguished precisely by this quality. Meaning, a posek isn't just somebody who knows books. It's somebody who's wise, who knows how to read into questions, understand where to place them, and to figure out what should be the right response and what other considerations are brought to play into addressing this question. It needs not only total familiarity with halachic tradition, meaning you don't just need to know halachic sources to pasken halacha, but also an immersion in all aspects of Jewish spirituality, so that one's intuitive responses are immediately recognizable as das Torah. By the way, I want to be clear, the phrase das Torah, often people would say, surely Rabbi Sacks doesn't recognize such a phenomenon. In fact, he discusses that in his book, One People, and is distinguished between two types of das Torah. What he's saying here is there is a certain notion called Torah intuition. And that very much should guide the posek in their halachic decision-making. In fact, that's a core ingredient in how they answer a question. This is a picture Maimonides drew of the sage, and is something of what it means by the term Gadol Hador. In this review, and now he's about to introduce his 3 questions, which we're not going to read, but I'm happy to send you those pages from Le'ela. In this review, we consider 3 problems recently discussed in the halachic literature, all of which share the quality of situational complexity. And I love that phrase. You'll see he refers back time and again to the term situation or situational. In each case, the widest resource of halacha are brought to bear on questions which do not admit of a simple answer. As well as their intrinsic interest, they show the multi-level character of the halachic process. We've read 1 paragraph of Rabbi Sacks describing how halacha is determined, and I hope you feel, as I do, that both how he writes and what he says is gripping. What he's done is tried to unpack the personality of a posek and the qualifications and qualities that such a posek should have. It's not just knowledge. It's a sense of understanding what is the wanton will of Torah, a sense of what we would call da'at Torah, a sense of understanding the time and place when the question is being asked, and what he described here, awareness of situational complexity. Now, this language, unfortunately, hasn't necessarily filtered into the training grounds of future poskim. But I would hope that by sharing this material, it will in the future, because these terms are so precious. And they help us understand what a posek should know and who they should be. If there are no immediate questions on this paragraph, and if there are, feel free to share them in the chat. I'd like to now talk about how halacha is determined. Is it merely just by precedent, or is there a form of creativity? You'll recall that was the title of one of his essays about creativity and innovation in halacha. And here we address the question, and this comes from that talk, 3 Approaches to Halacha. Is halacha only decided by direct halachic precedent? And he says the following. Well, in fact, I'll answer it very simply. No. Halacha isn't just determined by the law as seen in a book, even the law as found in a precedent. Why so? Why isn't halacha decided that way? If, for example, a situation arises, and I know a very similar situation arose in the lifetime of a great posek, perhaps not that long ago, surely my job is simply to replicate what they said. And Rabbi Sacks, if he would be here, would be shaking his head saying, no. The halacha itself may be clear, yet the halachist may still argue that we should not permit the permitted or forbid the forbidden. Why? Because the posek has wider considerations to take into account. What will the effect of his ruling be? What are the needs of the moment? What impact will a ruling have on the future of orthodoxy? The posek doesn't always ask such questions, continues Rabbi Sacks. He only asks them in key or critical, or what lawyers call hard cases. But when he asks them, he is forced to consider not just precedent, but also policy, not just the past, but also the future. This is so important. And especially nowadays when people feel that they have access to large swathes of halachic writings with online databases, and people think that with that can help you decide halacha. That's such a small part of the recipe. What he says here is, yes, you need that, but you also need to know what's happening on the ground, what's happening with the people, what are the needs of the hour. If you rule this way in this moment, what will happen in the future? And that means that the posek needs to have foresight. They need to have a sense of what will be in the future. Ezu chacham haro'et hanolad. Who is a wise person? Somebody who sees the outcome of what they decide now. And so precedent alone isn't the sole ingredient to a psak halacha. Sure, it certainly gives us an idea of what has been done in the past, and one should honor certain historical precedents wherever possible. But that doesn't mean one is chained to them, because every tkufa, every chapter in Jewish history has its own unique challenges. Any questions or thoughts on this before we move on? Can you see what he's offering here is a very sophisticated understanding of how Jewish law is determined. It's not just about copy and paste precedent. It's not just about knowing text. It's not even just about listening to rulings of the past and just saying, I'll do that again now. It's about understanding situational complexity. What will the effect of this ruling be? Which is why no posek can really live in a bubble. They need to have conversations with their peers and ask themselves, if we rule this way, what do you think the future will be? They need to consult not just about whether they've interpreted the text correctly, but whether they've interpreted the present, the situation, the moment correctly. With that in mind, let's now talk about the rabbi, the educator, and the posek. And this comes from his article again, about contemporary halacha. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, maybe from the zero response. I'll check that out in again. He says a point rarely mentioned in discussions about the rabbinate is that Judaism is, since the destruction of the temple, a religion of laymen. In fact, it is. It's from his piece on zero response, and I'll change that for anybody who wants a handout. He's talking here to his rabbinical peers. And he says, no, that most rabbis were lay people. Now, that may sound strange. In fact, many of my rabbinical friends draw the distinction between themselves and lay people. You may well hear that phrase, the rabbi is going to talk to the balabatim, which they translate as a lay people. What is Rabbi Sacks saying here? Judaism, since the destruction of the temple, is a religion of lay people. And it was from this that the Talmid Chacham derived his strength. And the rabbi too was a layman. He worked for a living. He was involved in the world of the people he was seeking to influence. If he was not, this in itself undermined his authority. Hence, Rabbi Joshua's cutting remark to Rabbi Gamliel, woe for the generation of which you are the leader, of which you know so little about the troubles of scholars and the struggles they have to endure to make a living. What was he saying? Rabbi Joshua was saying to Rabbi Gamliel, how can you pasken for a generation when you don't understand the needs of the people on the street? And what that tells us is, for somebody to determine Jewish law, they need to live the life of the people they're determining Jewish law for. They can't live in ivory towers, because if they do, they don't understand the crises, the challenges, the struggles, the pressures that the people they're assisting are experiencing. In fact, and this came within a discussion in Anglo Jewry about whether Anglo-Jewish rabbis should continue to wear canonicals. And Rabbi Sacks says, you guys are discussing whether rabbis should be wearing canonicals. Let me tell you something. The very fact that you are a professional rabbinate is more of a problem than you necessarily realize. Just think about this. He says the fact that a professional rabbinate is far more obviously against the spirit and letter of halacha than it is of wearing canonicals. The debate belongs to history, true, but there is another concern which is certainly highly relevant today. The rabbi is educated in all the more as posek, must be rooted in economic and social realities for those for whom he is responsible. Just think, he's actually saying something so important for us, which is, if a religious leader is living such a different life to those whom he is leading, it disqualifies that religious leader from being able to truly give good advice. Not because they're not intelligent or not wise, because they aren't feeling the feelings, the anguish, the pressures and strain of living a layperson's life. This unstated axiom is implicit in almost every dimension of rabbinic law, based as it is on a shrewd perception of human psychology and the strains to which the Torah is exposed everyday life. He goes on to say the professional rabbi's community is open and his life is relatively closed. Rarely does he have first-hand experience of the problems of his congregants bring to him. And that may be why they bring them to him as a last resort. He says this explicitly, when all else fails, try the rabbi, at least he should have a chance of failing too. Because at least when he was writing this, and this was a piece called Zero Response in 1983, not Contemporary Halacha, he says, if your community feels that you don't understand the life they're leading, then they're going to feel that you can give them sound advice. And he goes on to say, this, according to Maritz Chias, is the essential difference between the rabbi and the prophet. The rabbi has to make his case. His limited world experience may make the rabbi's teaching this ruling dangerously irrelevant. They may indeed lead him to rule incorrectly, but he is not constantly in touch with genuine posek. Just think, here he was in 1983, a young rabbinic leader, and telling his rabbinic colleagues, most of whom are significantly older than him, stop talking about canonicals. Trust me, the fact you're a professional rabbinate means that you may well be totally disconnected from your community. You need to be relevant. You need to understand your people. You need to know their world. This is an essential qualification for a Rav and certainly for a posek. And if you knew Rabbi Sacks, you can imagine him saying this with this insistent passion. You've got to know the world where your community is coming from. Otherwise, how can you be there for them? And overall, what he's offering here is actually a sharp critique on what he calls here the professional rabbinate, where a person isn't earning a living, but instead is given a salary by necessarily the community. Yes, they work, but they're working in a bubble. As he says, it's almost a closed world rather than an open world. You'd urge people, go out to the open, see what's going on. And then as a result of that, your community will understand you more. And when you think about this isn't just words that Rabbi Sacks said, it's how he lived. He went out to the world, and that's why we related to him. He was there on the street, and that's why we understood him, because we felt he understood us. We felt he understood our problems, our troubles, our challenges. So having explained all this, so what does a posek actually need to know? Well, obviously, he said a posek needs to know halachic literature and also needs to understand the needs of the hour. Here in his essay on creativity and innovation and halacha, he's very, very precise, and he makes reference again to that engagement between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel. In modernity, the posek must have a critical, historical, and sociological awareness if he is to speak cogently to the contemporary situation without unconsciously admitting alien values into the halachic system. Meaning, they don't just need to know halachic sources, they need to understand history, they need to understand sociology. They need to know what is Judaism and what is emerging from the wider world. The great pasken command admiration precisely for this quality of insight into what the hour requires, while yet echoing eternity. He goes on to say, to my mind, the most serious issue confronting contemporary halacha is not a lack of creativity. Often people said, rabbis aren't creative enough. He said, no, it's a sociological divorce between the sense of psak, nowadays largely the yeshivot, and the sense of congregational life. Meaning he felt that too many times decisions for communities were emerging from people who didn't understand the life of those living in communities, like he said beforehand. Psak involves applying Torah in its unchanging totality to Jewish life in its present specificity. A law interpreter, no less than a lawmaker, must have a clear objective understanding of the lives he's called on to instruct. As he says again, he quoted that in 1983, now in 1989. Rabbi Yeshua once suggested Rabbi Gamliel's capacity to lead the Jewish community was compromised by his ignorance of the economic conditions in which they lived. The same surely would be true of a posek who was ignorant of their intellectual and cultural circumstances. So you need to know the world. You need to read the newspaper. You need to know what's going on, both in terms of finance and in terms of politics. Because otherwise, the world in which you're called on to rule is unfamiliar territory to you. Now, in the next couple of lines, he says something even more perhaps surprising. Because oftentimes what I hear amongst my modern Orthodox friends and mentors is that we need more modern Orthodox poskim. Well, Rabbi Sacks addressed this directly. He said, our lack is not of modern Orthodox poskim, but of poskim who fully understand contemporary Am Yisrael. This, meaning, we don't need poskim with a particular ideology. We need poskim with an understanding of who they're talking to. Not of those who find a way of saying yes, but those whose yes and no address us equally without the authority of with the authority of one who understands our situation and the authenticity of one through whom the whole of the Torah speaks. Sorry for the type. Think about those words: authority, authenticity. That's what you need. You don't need just somebody who is makel, who says yes to everything. He said that you need people who say yes and who say no, but they do so because they understand you. They do so because they understand your situation. They do so because they're an authority, not just in text, but in the world. And they're authentic. They live the world they're called on to rule upon. So, having explained this, Rabbi Sacks discusses So when we pasken halacha, when we decide Jewish law, is it just for the frum people? Is it just for the religious? Is it just for the ones who are already bound into the halachic system? And he is very firm in rejecting this. This is in his talk about the three approaches to halacha. The role of halacha is to function as a constitution of an entire people, Rav HaTzibur, the majority of the community. It is self-evident that halacha may not be promulgated in such a way as to alienate a substantial section of the community. This is what he talks about in terms of inclusivist halacha, which he discussed at length in his book, One People. This needed no proof because it was integral to the very concept of halacha as the expression of the covenant between God and the entire people. The halachist was not a prophet, a mouthpiece of God, nor was he just a neighbor. He was essentially a mediator, says Rabbi Sacks, between God and the people, between the unalterable demands of the law and the varied reactions of the people. And like all mediators, his task was strategic diplomacy. He has to include everyone within the law without changing the law. Now that's a great task. That's a great challenge. And how does he explain it? Well, I want to share with you one of the most, in many ways, exquisite readings of Tanakh you'll find. And when you read it, it will hopefully stick to you as it did with me. And he says it here in this essay. He says there's a famous rabbinic commentary to the first word of the Torah. Bereshit. Bereshit, we know that's the first word of the Torah. God created the world, said the sages, not in the beginning, but for the beginning, for the sake of two things, which are called Reshit, beginning. One is Torah, which is called Reshit, Reshit Dalko. One is the Jewish people, which is also called Reshit Torah, the beginning of God's harvest. That means that Torah begins a word Bereshit, for Reshit, and that means for Torah and for the Jewish people. And says Rabbi Sacks, these are the supreme agadic values, Torah and Israel, Jewish law and the Jewish people. Between them, they constitute the purpose of creation. In Torah, God revealed his will. In the Jewish people, he created the witnesses to his presence. That Torah and Am Yisrael are ultimate values is an assertion of Agadah. A world without Torah and a world without Am Yisrael are equally unthinkable. And these are the key words I want you to remember. The supreme halachic task, and he's not saying this is a halachic question. This is embedded in every halachic question. The supreme halachic task is therefore to mediate between them, which takes precedence in a practical conflict between Jewish law and the Jewish people. This is the ultimate halachic question. What Rabbi Sacks is saying is, when somebody is called upon to decide Jewish law, they're representing two different voices. One is Torah, the law. One is Jewish people, the receivers of the law, the observers of the law. And sometimes they're in conflict. Sometimes one needs to be malamed zchut for the people, and in so doing seemingly assert that the law is less demanding. Sometimes you need to demand the law and seemingly imply that the Jewish people are not doing what they should. That is the ultimate halachic question. How do you create the right balance? And that means a posek has to have a deep commitment to Torah, but a deep commitment to the entirety of the Jewish people, because as he said beforehand, it's the role of halacha is for the entire people. We need to think about everybody. And as we saw beforehand, a posek needs to be somebody who fully understands contemporary Am Yisrael. Now, having said all this, the question is, okay, so a shaila is asked of a posek, perhaps a big one. What do they do? What is the right thing to do, especially when trying to balance these different needs of the Torah and the Jewish people? And this is what he really explores in his lecture, Three Approaches to Halacha. He says, a halachist does not ask what the halacha, but also when and how do we apply the halacha? When do we speak? When should we be silent? Meaning sometimes the best halachic response is saying nothing. What behavior may we tolerate? What must we take a stand about? When may we apply a ruling more lenient than the consensus? A posek pays close attention both to a particular problem and the context in which it arises. What kind of community is this? What will the effects be? We mentioned that before. His methods are ad hoc and never generalized. He uses what I call situational diplomacy, the halachic repertoire of lenient rulings, tactical silence, strategic non-enforcement, of gradually raising halachic standards when the moment is right and the community is ready. He tries to include everyone within his halachic community. This sets him apart from the exclusivists. He does so using traditional halachic precedent, and this sets him apart from the revolutionary inclusivists. When you understand this, and here he's beautifully painted the landscape of what it means to be a posek. It means to consider both the past, precedent, the present in terms of needs, and the future in terms of effects. It's to consider Torah, what you represent, but also the people. It's to ask yourself, maybe now isn't right, but in the future, it will be the better time to speak up. And not be too bold as to make a ruling out of sync with the entire tradition, because every psak should work within the framework from which it emerges. So these are a handful of thoughts on Rabbi Sacks on psika. And in his interview in 2012, which I mentioned, with HaChevra Samuelson, he is asked directly, okay, so what does a posek really need to be? So they need to know halacha, they need to know sociology, they need to understand economics, they need to live in the moment, be aware of the past and cognizant of the future. What else? And he says, and he speaks directly, to be a real world-class posek, one has to know what kind of system we are dealing with here. Judges in Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court in ancient times, had to be fluent in all the scientific disciplines of their time. It seems to me that the same applies today. The great halachists, whether or not they had formal academic training, always had that broad sense and sweep, that to rule on questions of medical ethics, they knew medicine, that to rule on business ethics, they had a broad understanding of economics and trade. Nowadays, it's important to have a grasp of the natural sciences, a rough sense of what natural law theorists have to say, as well as what legal theorists such as Dworkin and Kava have to say. I think most of the great halachists had a sense of philosophy, whether or not they studied it formally. They made fine conceptual distinctions. They had a rigorous and disciplined mind. They understood the large issues at stake, in which they may seem to be very localized and detailed legal questions. And when you read this, which is just brilliant, you ask yourself, okay, as he says, you don't necessarily have to have a degree in all these things, but are we training poskim with this? As he said before, it's not a question of having modern Orthodox poskim. It's about having poskim respond to the needs of greater Am Yisrael, who understand what it means to be part of the Jewish people, but also understand the situation, the moment we're living in. Are they aware of trends in economics? Are they aware of science and developments in that area? If not, how can they pasken? That's the question. How can they pasken? And therefore, Rabbi Sacks's remarks here and previously, the ones I've quoted, I think have a direct bearing on training, have a direct bearing on expectations. To pasken halacha isn't just to know books, isn't even just to know precedent. That's such a small part of the wider issue. Instead, it's to know moments, to know people, to know need, and also sometimes to know when to speak. I'll end by quoting just a very brief exchange between himself and his teacher, Rabbi Nachum Abrinovich, which is mentioned at the back of Mesilot B'Vavam, where Rabbi Sacks asked his teacher, as a posek, would you be, or did you often find yourself guided by broad ethical imperatives when you came to actually give a psak? He asked his Rebbe, his teacher, his mentor, about whom he spoke so much in terms of Rabbi Rabinovich's ability to pasken halacha. To what extent is ethical imperatives central to your halachic decision-making? To which Rabbi Rabinovic says, I think that unless one is guided by broad ethical imperatives, as you described them, psak is not worth the paper it's written on. Meaning, halacha isn't disconnected from values. Halacha isn't divorced from agadah. The study of Jewish law needs to be connected with and associated and drawn from an understanding of the needs of the hour, which is why, as he mentioned in 1983, there is a great danger of having community rabbanim who don't understand their community, don't understand the world in which they're living in, who live ultimately a closed life. In fact, a rav, and certainly a posek, basically has to sell themselves as being somebody who's worthy, somebody who is relevant, because of the suspicion that they don't get it. If we took what Rabbi Sacks said seriously, If you really absorb them, and as I say, I collated most of these sources already 7 years ago when I wrote a little short paper on this topic. If you really, really digested what he said here, this would have an impact on training undoubtedly, but it also have an impact on the relationship between community member and rabbi. And Rabbi Targum was very kind earlier on to introduce me as the work that I do as this virtual rabbi, being a rabbi for those without a rabbi. That's a great privilege. But the fact is that many people aren't turning to their local rabbis because they don't feel they understand them. And if they were to ponder and really reflect deeply on what Rabbi Sacks said, I think people would have deeper, richer relationships with their spiritual guides. Shilas are not being asked would be asked. And we as a community would get stronger. We feel more proud, more confident. When we go into the business and marketplace, we'd feel that halacha has a response to the challenges we're facing on a daily basis. What Rabbi Sacks does, nothing short of here, is give us guidance, not just to who is qualified to pasken halacha for modern age, but how should halacha be understood? What are the needs of congregants in terms of viewing and valuing halacha? And as a result of that, what a halachic personality of posek should be to make sure that they remain relevant and compelling to those who are living lives, to those with questions, to those who may, if felt understood, turn to their guide for the questions they have, and thereby help them live a life which is more aligned with Jewish law and more consonant with Jewish values. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Apologies for the handful of typos. I'll fix those and send them through to you for those who want the handout. But as you can see here, though perhaps not so well known, these gems are so beautiful. They radiate with wisdom, and they speak very much to our time. And they apply not just to how we train rabbinical leaders, but also what we expect from those we turn to, and what kind of qualifications we should ask when we turn to people for meaningful religious guidance. If you have any questions, happy to answer. If none, no problems. But again, I very much thank Rabbi Targ and also Daniel here on the line for the opportunity for sharing this wisdom. So we have a point here. There's no gzeirot shatzibur echol amod b'hem. This is an example of consideration of Yisrael as reishit, meaning when decrees are established, they need to be established with an awareness of what the people can handle, what's within their ability. And I think that's exactly what Rabbi Sacks was discussing. He actually makes specific reference to that in one of the sources I quoted. But we need to understand where the people are at. And that itself is really part of the qualification of a Rav or posek. Do you understand the people? Do you understand where they're at? And once you do, then you'll be able to answer, is this a decree, or is this a position, or is this an expectation that the people can handle, or is this basically beyond the realm for the majority of people? And if Rav Tzibur can't handle it, then it's wrong. It can't be inclusivist halachic psak policy. Somebody had a hand up. Feel free to unmute. I'm not in control of these clever things.
Hello, Rav Johnny. It's Vivian Simonoff here.
Hi, Vivian.
Hi. I mean, as always, you delivered on tremendous shir and with great kavod to an incredible Rav. I guess I kind of came with an expectation because of the title of the talk, who is qualified, to sort of leave with a short list or some sort of an idea. But having seen what you've delivered, what you've given are the qualifications that we the people, sound very American, that we the people should be asking of our Rabbonim or looking to see in our Rabbonim. So I guess my question to you is, which direction do you feel that our Rabbonim are going in? Are we 7 years on from when you first started doing this? Are we closer now to having poskim who fulfill this criteria, or do you feel we're moving further away?
It's a great question. It's a great question because I kind of addressed it in a talk I gave just last week in the UK, where I spoke about this thing called modern Orthodox interiority. From all the evidence I've gathered, and including an interview with between the head of the Yeshiva University Smicha program and David Bashevkin just a couple of months ago, the weight placed on Jewish philosophy and extra material beyond halacha in rabbinical training programs is not nothing, but to my mind is nowhere near sufficient to fulfill the expectation of Rabbi Sacks. Now, that's not to say, by the way, some of those people in that program don't already have that knowledge. What it does mean is, if we expect people to have that awareness, we need to build programs which take Jewish philosophy seriously, which is what Rabbi Novich says. In fact, in that book, Misilot Bilvavam, he is highly critical of the way in which we don't spend enough time investing in considering Jewish thought, because what you saw in these quotes from Rabbi Sacks is Jewish law doesn't live in a vacuum. It lives within an ecosystem of Jewish values and Jewish thought. And so to study Jewish law without paying serious attention to those Jewish values and Jewish thought, it means that you can know the source and know the precedent and still pasken wrong, if that makes sense. So my humble opinion, and again, I'm not making any particular remark about any particular people. There are some really fine practitioners and poskim in our day, but the training that I'm aware is taking place, my feeling is a little bit too myopic, and hopefully there should be supplementary training programs to help people to understand some of these things being described. I would make it clear, and Rabbi Sacks himself says this, it's not necessarily that the posek has to have a degree in economics and a degree in sociology to be a posek. They have to have a decent working knowledge of X, Y, Z, and that decent working knowledge should be something that should have taken some time to develop and should be nuanced and sophisticated, because the questions people are asking are nuanced, are sophisticated. And I can say from the people that turn to me, and I'm not always qualified to answer questions people ask me, but where I am, and I ask, why are you talking to me? And the general response is because a person I'd like to speak to doesn't seem to be familiar with this field, this seemingly secondary field of Jewish living, which for my question is central to Jewish decision-making. So I mean, the reason I'm sharing this is because I think what Rabbi Sacks taught us is valuable and it's worthy of sharing and it should be applied, and each obviously institution as they so wish, but I don't think we're any closer. And even so, even Rabbi Sacks himself tried to push the Anglo-Jewish community in this direction, and he himself would probably say he didn't get that far, meaning he got to a certain measure, but he would be the first to say, I wrote that, like I mentioned in the article, he encouraged the community, the rabbinic community, to engage in a series of questions. And then he said, zilch, nobody responded. What's your problem? What's the issue? Come on, peeps. And at times it takes a while for people to be prepared to look inward and ask themselves, what else can we do? Nowadays, there are training programs there. They are in the US, they are in Israel, and they should be welcomed. And I'm delighted about that. But I still think that there are quite a few people for whom there's work to be done. I would say one final thing, which is what he said about modern Orthodox poskim. Don't judge the quality of posek based on the hat on their head. That's absurd, and Rabbi Sacks would say it's absurd. Judge them about their understanding of the world and their love of Torah and the Jewish people. That is a critical criteria. If that's present, wonderful. That's not present, no matter what person is wearing on their head, it's not going to be quite the outcome that he thinks should be the ideal, at least. Any other immediate thoughts, follow-up? Obviously, I'm happy to send my email address if people have any follow-up queries. I take that as a no. If that's the case, okay, well, it's been a pleasure. Again, for those who want, in fact, I will share my email address here. For those who want, I will make the minor corrections to the handout, and then happy to send that with you, or maybe I'll post that on Facebook now as well. But thank you again for that. Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you for all that you're doing, because, you know, these are important conversations to be had. And just for those who haven't listened, I also was listening to a number of the previous videos, and they're all really, really very wonderful. So if you take a chance, have a look at the site, mizrahi.org/Rabbi Sacks, if I'm correct, and you can see all the previous talks that have been given. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Johnny. My teacher, I say my teacher, both my former teacher as well as our current teacher. Thanks very much for your wonderful lecture. I found it actually fascinating. I'm sure everyone agrees here. First of all, your presentation was great. And also because as a student, I consider myself a student of Rabbi Sacks. And we, generally speaking, Rabbi Sacks is not thought of a halachist. We think of him in terms of philosophy. But it's absolutely fascinating to see the works that you've unearthed of him regarding halacha. So thank you very much for sharing that with Johnny. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and wishing you all Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, Kol Tov. Be well, everyone.